Welcome, Will.
Thank you very much.
I know what they're all thinking right now. Finally, the regulator is here.
Exactly.
No, but it's so great you're here. I mean, understanding the power of big tech companies and, if necessary, addressing it, controlling it is so important. You're the Senior Director for the Digital Markets Unit, DMU, at the Competition Market Authority, CMA. So you're an acronym nestled within an acronym.
I'm afraid so.
I think maybe we should start out by you explaining what the DMU is and what your mandate is.
Sure. I mean, perhaps just briefly on the CMA as a whole. So our job as a whole is to make markets work for consumers, businesses, and the economy. And we do that through a whole range of things: consumer law enforcement, competition law enforcement.
I mean, would the equivalent in the US be the FTC?
Somewhere between the FTC and the DOJ, or the combination.
Okay.
And so within that, the Digital Markets Unit has been set up to prepare for a new framework that the government's planning to legislate for, to consider the market power of the very most powerful firms, particularly in platform markets, and work out how to open up some of those markets to more innovation and more competition.
And I want to come back to the phrase you used, planning to legislate. But first, I was sort of curious what our audience, how much they knew about the DMU and the CMA. So we designed a live poll, so we could maybe throw that up on the screen, just sort of asking about current impressions of the CMA. Might reveal something of the political leanings. But while we wait for results, so earlier in the year, there was a statutory commitment from the government to sort of to give statutory powers to the DMU, formalizing the role, strengthening your enforcement abilities. That's still pending. So give us an update and tell us what it means that this law hasn't yet been passed.
So the government has stated in the Queen's speech in May that it plans to publish a draft bill this session of Parliament, which will create this new framework. And we're working with the government on the underlying policy and preparing to implement that when it comes in. But we're on a bit of a twin track approach, because while we're doing that, and we think that's important to be able to really tackle some of these issues most fully, meanwhile we have our existing powers, and so we're using those to the best of our ability, again, to try and tackle some of the problems we see deriving from market power in some of these sectors.
I feel like you're like a superhero without the cape right now. So what is it? How far? What are the limits without this law being passed, and what you can do to follow through on some of the investigations you've conducted?
Yeah. So the traditional tools have been around for a long time. They were all set up essentially before digital was a thing, and they're still effective for certain things, but they are, we think, not quite sufficient to deal with some of the challenges here. And that's to do with enforcement action in particular being backward-looking, having to be quite narrowly targeted to a specific issue, it being quite difficult to design remedies that will actually be effective in the market. So what's needed is a bit of a shift to being able to set some of the rules up front frankly in a more collaborative way with the companies concerned than is really can really work under that enforcement framework, so that we can get better results more quickly in the market, and again open those markets up to stronger competition, more innovation, create more of a level playing field for businesses other than the very biggest ones to compete fairly.
Right. Now, one aspect of the mandate is to help the CMA review mergers. And now you've warned me that you have to be careful in addressing specific cases, so let me try to be suitably oblique. Well, one thing that the CMA has and outsiders have wished for is more action on so-called killer acquisitions. These deals by big tech companies to buy smaller firms and maybe park them or kill them entirely. So I guess I wonder, do regulators have the necessary tools right now to stop these kinds of deals?
So the work of looking at mergers it takes a similar approach across sectors. We are always focused on the evidence, always trying to understand what's going on, whatever industry that's in. What we said, particularly in relation to the move to digital, is that we need to be able to think harder about the prospects for future competition, and that's partly as a result of us and others around the world having looked back at past acquisitions and thought, perhaps we should have asked some tougher questions about where that might be going at the time. And so we've been doing that in these sectors.
Well, that's really interesting. So the key is looking how it impacts future competition. So not evaluating where a market is and how a deal that seems small might impact things now, but looking ahead and saying, well, can this lead to anti-competitive outcomes?
Exactly. By its nature, merger control is always forward-looking because you're saying there are two companies wanting to merge. What's the effect on competition likely to be in the future? So we always need to try and think about dynamic competition. But here, I think in particular, we're trying to think about what this might mean for innovation in the future in these markets, whereas we know innovation is so critical.
Wait, so now let me have a go at one specific case. So you guys had some success with the Facebook Giphy acquisition. You largely won in court on most of the counts, although it was remanded to you for one individual count. The CMA has also, I think, had some success with the gene editing companies Grail and Illumina. And so I guess I wonder, is there anything of a turning point here in the UK or in Europe in general in stopping these kinds of deals between big companies that could potentially squash competition?
I mean, I'd hesitate to describe some sweeping trend. Again, we go through a clearly set out process on any merger we look at. We have this two-stage process where we do an initial investigation, where we have to work out if there is a realistic prospect of a reduction in competition. Subject to that, we can then take it to a second stage, where we have to work out whether it's more likely than not that there'll be a reduction in competition. And at that second stage, an independent panel is appointed. It's nothing to do with the CMA board or the CMA staff, and they have to take the decision. So that's what happened on the Meta Giphy acquisition.
And Microsoft Activision.
That's now gone to that second stage as well. So as I said, it's an independent, evidence-driven process. Those points I described about future competition, innovation, those are, if you like, about the questions we try to ask ourselves as we go through the work, but it always has to come back to the evidence.
Well, let me ask it this way on Microsoft Activision. I mean, that's the biggest deal in Microsoft history. I believe it's the biggest deal in the history of the video game industry. Is it getting a more vigorous review right now in the UK than it would have gotten before the DMU was formed, maybe 5 years ago in a different regulatory climate?
Well, 5 years ago would have been rather different anyway, because this deal, like any big global deal, would have responsibility for that would have resided in Brussels. So now we have to think about that in London too. I mean, look, it's a really big acquisition. It's hard to think that 5 years ago,
might have not even happened.
that we would have just somehow glossed over it. It still looks like a big, significant deal. I think almost whatever lens you put on the market. But I mean, just to underline, there are other deals in tech, for example, Facebook Customer at the time and Microsoft Nuance that we looked at and then cleared. And indeed, Norton Avast, we looked at phase 1, thought there would be a problem, came to phase 2, and actually we switched the decision and cleared it.
Okay. Well, let me take a step back. So the DMU has conducted some 10 investigations looking into mobile platforms, online advertising, Amazon. When you kind of consider the body of this work and step back, what conclusions can you draw about the state, the health of competition in the UK when it comes to tech? Are tech markets healthy in the UK right now?
So I think that's probably too big a question to answer simply, as you know. But we certainly worry about tendencies towards market power and the prospects for that market power being competed away, if you like, naturally. And so that's what lies behind what we think is the need for a new approach. The idea being that we would need to pass, it would be a very high bar, but we would be saying there are certain companies in particular markets that have such an entrenched position of market power that they need essentially an element of special treatment. And without that, we're in this position where we can go in with specific cases here and there, but it can be difficult to really go after the real underlying source of the market power. But it all comes down to the specifics. And I would say if we had to describe a sort of USP for ourselves among authorities like us, it's really on really understanding the business models and really doing the work to understand the market in the round, try to work out what's going on, what the risks might be, also what the many benefits are from these markets.
Yeah.
So we've done that in most depth on digital advertising, so particularly Google, thinking about Google in search and Facebook and social media. And we've just completed the study on the mobile sector. And so there we can really build what we think is a really good understanding of those markets and then work out what might be the right action to take.
Well, let me ask about that, because this is an incredibly concentrated market, 2 major players, complete consolidation, lots of gatekeeping power in terms of what apps make it onto our phones and what don't. They take a toll of every piece of commercial revenue that passes through our phones. So you've conducted, one of the most in-depth studies of that market. What does intervention or remedy look like?
Yeah, so exactly. We, as you say, we've just spent 800 pages essentially explaining what you've just summarized. And
what does the last page say? Summarize it.
So the answer to that is we've got a set of things which we are either doing already or considering doing immediately with our current powers. So those are, we have 2 competition cases in relation to Google and Apple's in-app requirement to use their own in-app payments services. We have consulted on a market investigation specifically into web browser restrictions and cloud gaming, which are all about the worry that the rules that those gatekeepers are setting are essentially shutting off competition from smaller firms. So, for example, the web developer who might want to develop a sophisticated web app and can't get that to the iPhone because of the way that the browser software is configured. So these are the precise remedies are quite specific, and we've got a list, if you like, of sort of 10 to 15 concerns across those 2 mobile ecosystems, and the approaches needed for each one have to be quite specific as well.
Right. Now, Apple has its reasons for exerting such control over the iOS ecosystem, right? It wants to preserve order on the ecosystem. It doesn't want third parties to create redundant stores beyond its own payment mechanism. Has it been receptive to your suggestions? And do you find its justifications for exerting control over the iPhone ecosystem to be disingenuous or self-serving?
So that is exactly the job, answering those questions is exactly the job of these kinds of investigations. So on the payments ones, those are in flight, so depends on what we find through the course of those. On the browsers thing, for example, we have had lots of engagement, as you might imagine, from Apple, and a lot of that is about the importance of privacy and security for users, which, as a general principle, we
support that.
We wouldn't. It's hard
Sounds good.
It's hard to dispute that. But the question that we are, if you like, working out whether to ask ourselves through this proposed investigation is whether those arguments, if you like, whether they stack up, whether it's really necessary to put such rigid controls as we see in place in order to achieve those benefits, or whether it's possible to achieve the benefits while actually still allowing somewhat greater competition.
Right. I mean, these are exactly the right questions, but it just strikes me that we've been asking them for a long time, and not the DMU, but in the US, for example, the investigation of online ad networks has been ongoing in the US forever. And as someone who writes about big tech and is somewhat sensitive to the concerns of smaller players who complain about the big tech companies, I just wonder, why does it take so long? What about the process here, I don't know, the political process or the regulatory process, is drawing out what appears to be a consensus about resolving consolidation in tech? Yeah,
so the processes in the US are different to the ones here, and it's more litigation driven through the courts, and so that has its own requirements. One does need to take a decent amount of time to, as I said, to really think through and understand these issues. But I think you can. I mean, there are some well-known, if you like, case studies of how difficult it is to really get to useful results through the traditional enforcement tools. Probably the most obvious one that's often quoted is Google Shopping in Europe, where the complaint was back in 2011, and that's sort of still rumbling on. And I don't think anyone in that case, and I don't think
it's still alive.
I'm not sort of casting aspersions on anyone. I just think it's fairly obvious to say that
they didn't think it would take a decade.
Well, the complainant probably isn't that happy. Other participants in the market probably aren't that happy. Consumer bodies probably aren't that happy, and I'm pretty sure Google might not be happy either, just because it's a very long, drawn-out process and a very difficult.
No, I
way of
remember the
getting to a result.
plaintiffs aren't even around in it. Those companies don't exist, as far as I know.
Yeah, it takes a long time. Again, things can move very fast in these markets, hence the need for a structure that's able to move faster with that if you're really able to make any useful headway.
Right. Well, one of the investigations that you've conducted that I'm the most interested in is the Amazon one. And you've been, I think, since the summer, talking to sellers in the UK about the Amazon platform. What can you tell us about, what you've heard and Amazon's response? Is it too early to give us a little determination as to whether there might be some anti-competitive effects in the way Amazon administers its marketplace?
I'm afraid it is too early.
Darn, okay.
Okay,
that. Well, what can you tell us about that case?
That it started and that we're gathering evidence, talking to all the people you'd expect us to be talking to. And again, we need to let that run its course to really work out what's going on. Those investigations have a clear set of processes by which you have to get the information in and consult carefully on any outcomes.
I mean, these big tech companies, with tears streaming down their faces, hold up the small and medium-sized business as their constituency, and the way in which they help them is so important to them. And yet, here are cases examining whether it's a double-edged sword, right? Whether the big platforms actually hurt as much as help sellers. I guess I'm wondering, is it, let me just turn it around. Is there something legitimate in the way in which these few powerful tech platforms allow small businesses, and in the case of Amazon, sellers, to scale instantly and to build strong businesses?
So I'll talk in generalities rather than about Amazon, but yes, absolutely. There are big benefits from these markets. We absolutely don't dispute that, and for precisely those reasons. I mean, not just access to a large market, maybe even global in some cases, but entire new business models that didn't exist however long ago, and that's wonderful. But if power builds to the extent that those companies are almost impossible to dislodge, then that can result in problems both if you're a competitor to those companies directly, or if you're a firm that relies on that as a platform on which to do business. And so we think that we need to make sure that the terms of those platforms are offering are reasonable, and that they aren't shutting down routes to potential competition, which again are some of the issues that we've been looking at in the mobile space, where we're concerned that, for example, on the browsers piece, those restrictions put in place by Apple, we think look as if they are likely to cut off routes to competitors to Apple's benefit. But again, to be determined through the full process of these investigations. Interesting.
So we're running out of time, so let me hit a few more quick issues. In the US, we've seen antitrust bills, seemingly bipartisan support, emerge from committee, ready to go, completely founder under the weight of acrimony among politicians. What have you learned about using the legislative process to address some of these competitive issues? Is it futile considering the climate today? Maybe different in the UK than the US?
So I find the US much more mysterious, more familiar with the UK, obviously. I mean, we are independent from government, so what happens in legislation is not our job. Essentially, that's for the government to work out. We are here to do the job that we get given through statute. We have a certain job at the moment. As I said, the expectation is that that job will get added to through this new framework. We think it's quite important, as I said, to create some sharper tools, if you like, to be able to tackle some of these issues more quickly and more effectively. And yes, that does, in this instance, require legislation.
You're not an expert on US politics. I am not an expert on UK politics, but I'm led to believe that you have a new boss now, a new prime minister, who, as far as I can tell, is maybe more likely than her predecessor to be a pro-free market, anti-regulation. Do you have any idea how the administration of Liz Truss might affect the work of the CMA?
Generally speaking, no. As I said, we're independent from government and we are carefully apolitical. And as I said, we'll do the job we're given through Parliament. I mean, all I would say, when you talk about free markets and regulation, one thing that's important to keep in mind, I think, is that what we're talking about in this DMU framework is not red tape regulation across thousands of companies. We're talking about a handful of companies at most, where there is that very specific entrenched market power. And actually, if you're someone that really worries about free markets, I would argue that right now these markets are not free because they are at the behest of these big platforms in many cases. So what I think we can all agree probably we want is for competition to be effective and people to be able to have a fair crack of the whip. And when you've got this huge entrenched market power, there's a risk that can't happen.
Well, when you make that case to the new Prime Minister, we look forward to hearing how it goes. Thank you, Will Hayter.
Thanks very much, Brad.